Yo, this is me, Mike, Ringmaster of the Imagination Circus, and I'm here to give you something. This video is a bit of an outlier. It's a RWBY-based video, in case you can't tell. And by the title, you should definitely be able to tell, because of course, I've been wanting to do some more RWBY stuff for a while, but frankly, you know, it's hard to come up with, because everybody else in the RWBY fandom has a lot of the good stuff covered, so what could I possibly do? I don't want to do straight-up reviews. As much as I like the series, I don't really feel inclined to review it. So what do? Well,
No! God! No! No! No!
Why Qrow is not RWBY's dad. Period. Seriously. Guys, come on. I get it. Really, I do. I understand why you think that. Like, those of you who do. And again, my reasoning for making this video, I was watching a video where a guy... And granted, he actually was a little bit more sensical than a lot of the people who claim this. Like, some of them do it kind of without any sort of proof. And this guy at least backed up his claims very well. And don't get me wrong, there's definitely quote-unquote evidence for this idea. It's just never convinced me. But regardless, this guy was selling his argument, and I decided, you know what, I'm really curious. How many people actually believe this theory? You know what? And so I scrolled down to the comments, and there were way more than I expected, to at least in my mind, disturbing degree. And I'm sorry. Okay, if you believe this, I'm not going to discredit you. I mean, I guess I'm kind of doing that with making this video. But I'm not doing it to, like, you know, hurt anybody or just tell you you're dumb. It's just I personally don't believe it. And so I wanted to express why I personally don't believe that this is the case. So here's how this video is going to work. I'm going to, one, express my reasoning for why I don't think this is the case. And then I'm going to express not necessarily a theory, but kind of like my interpretation, my headcanon for how I think events went down. You know, for how I think the scenario that actually happened. But regardless, let's get into it, shall we? So, what do I think? Why am I not on board with this? Well, for one thing, and I know this isn't going to sell the idea to most of you, but, you know, rest in peace, before Monty died, he tried to tell us they were half-sisters. I believe him. And Miles, to this day, is kind of sick of having to reiterate they are only half-sisters. Guys, come on. I get it. I understand why you disagree. But, like, it's one thing for people, like, the creative people in making a story, like a show or a film or whatever, like, to lie to their audience when the audience has come to the right conclusion. I can understand your suspicion there. But when someone has to reiterate this idea to you multiple times, I mean, hell, if I was behind it, I wouldn't add fuel to the fire either way. I would have just, if someone was on the money with a theory, I wouldn't tell them they were wrong. I wouldn't acknowledge it at all, because that kind of just fuels the idea. But the fact that they've continuously outright denied this makes me think, yeah, it's just not true. I'm sorry. As for the apparent, at least in many people's minds, evidence, I get it. RWBY, you know, she is darker. She does have, like, Qrow's complexion, but it's not like she actually looks like Qrow. At least not in my mind, she doesn't. She looks like her mother, who we finally, I will admit, we only jest, but we finally got an actual picture of. And yeah, she looks like an older version of RWBY. So why is it that we have to assume, like, come on. Yeah, like, I mean, yeah... I mean, I get it, but genetics are complicated. Things are not as, like, it's not as simple as you think, okay? Just, okay, I'm sorry. I'm just getting a little frustrated. So that's not really evidence. Then there's, of course, her style, or the fact that she was trained by Qrow. Okay, I admit, it is a little odd off the top of its head that, like, Tai allowed Qrow to train RWBY. But it's not the weirdest thing in the world. We at least know that Tai trained Yang. And yeah, okay, maybe he didn't train RWBY. He allowed Qrow to do so. But he obviously trusts Qrow, or at least that's the impression I've gotten, even if we don't necessarily get the, like, maybe they don't have as solid a relationship as they once had. I think the two of them are more or less fine. I mean, I made a whole shipping video about the two of them. Yeah, that's in the description, by the way, in case you want to watch that. But yeah, like, I mean, seriously. But regardless, I think that's pretty simply put, just, you know, that's a fact. Like, yeah, RWBY modeled herself after her uncle, but that's really, and yeah, granted, they're otherwise not related by blood, but that's not the strangest thing in the world. People can have relationships with whoever they choose, and in this case, it's just, like, maybe it's not related by blood, but bond is more often than not and more important if the relationship between Yang and her biological mother are, you know, evidence of anything here. But regardless, the fact of the matter is, that, you know, like, they just happen to be particularly close. And if anything, the only reason anybody really thinks that the two are, like, you know, father and daughter is because we've had way more of a focus on that relationship than any of the other family dynamics, at least between RWBY and her own father. You know, Tai, who does exist and is in fact more than just Yang's father, at least in my head, because I'm pretty sure that's correct, but I will concede that at the very least it's mostly in my head, even though that's what's been told to us many, many times. So the point I'm trying to make is, when it comes to, like, this situation, the reason I think more than a number of people in the fandom are convinced that these two are in a relationship is because, like, this is the relationship that's focused on. We don't get to see, like, RWBY and Tai interact that much. But it's clear, at least the one time we do get to see the two actually interact, that he's more than, happy to have her home. Sure, like, I honestly think this is a factor. If we actually saw them interact, I think it would dispel at least a little bit of the belief that Qrow was RWBY's father. Because again, I think it's more than anything is based on the fact that that particular relationship is so heavily focused on. And yeah, the fact, like, I do buy, one of the points the guy made in his video, the reason, like, I made this video in response almost, is because, one of the points he made was that he believes, at least in his own head, that Qrow drinks because of Summer. And I actually do believe that. Not necessarily, granted, I am totally okay with the idea that Qrow was in love with Summer, but not necessarily, if anything, that would explain his weird focus, because I will admit, he does seem to have a strong amount of focus on RWBY, if they're not related, which I don't believe they are, at least by blood, if it's because he was in love with Summer, then okay, and if he drinks because of her, even better, because yeah, it would make sense. Maybe because, like, at that point, yeah, his own sister left, but that's no big, she's alive, he's probably still hunting her down at that point, and if anything, he almost expected it. He would probably be the least affected by Raven up and leaving. But as for Summer, you know, that was someone he had actually grown close to, someone who became family, and maybe more, at least in his mind. So when she died, I imagine that did have a strong effect to him. And maybe he was just a little bit more of a casual drinker before, but now he's a full-on, you know, functioning alcoholic. He is basically like a functioning alcoholic. It's not good regardless, but he is functional. So yeah, that's a minor thing, but that is, at least in my mind, like, it's simple, it's not a lot, but to be fair, it's not much more than what everybody who does support this idea has in their heads. It's like, one way or the other, it's not important. And another factor that I think, like, you know, at least lends in my favor when it comes to this idea is, if Qrow was RWBY's dad, well, okay, sure, maybe, but then when would it be revealed? Because I'm going to be honest, I don't think it would make sense for the story for that to be the case. And here's why. It's like, you know, familial drama, while not alien to RWBY, is not the focus of the series. If it is, at least in the case of, you know, Weiss, or in the case of Blake, which not really familial drama, but at least her, you know, situation with the White Fang, more, at least a personal drama. And, you know, that makes sense because it can be used to strengthen a character's relationship, to strengthen their character overall, but it doesn't, and if anything, it gives them more of a background, which is more or less what the White Fang and, like, you know, the CDC and the rest of the Schnee family does for Blake and Weiss, respectively. But with Ruby's case, I feel like a reveal of something like this would just distract from the main story. It would cause an unnecessary amount of drama when we've already got things we need to focus on, like the fact that, like you want something that's going to cause drama for Ruby, that's going to shake her to her core. How about the idea that, like, as has been mostly accepted by the fandom at this point, including me, the idea that Salem was, indirectly at least, responsible for Summer's death. Because if we accept that as true, then that's enough drama for Ruby to eventually deal with. Because that's going to do something to her. Who knows what it will be when we finally get that reveal, but it will do something. And I think, like, giving her that on, like, you know, and on top of that, with a reveal like that, the reveal that she's also not the child who she thought she was, I think that would probably be a little too much. I think it would be unnecessary, and I think it just wouldn't make sense for the story that Rooster Teeth and Miles and Carrie and the rest of the Qrow are telling at this point. So, no, I don't think that makes much sense. And this is my reasoning, my personal reasoning for why I personally do not believe that this is the case, that Ruby is the child of Summer and Qrow. However, I do have something else I want to bring up to the table, and that is a timeline of sorts, because people, whenever they support this theory, they come up to the conclusion that, you know, like Ty and Summer jumped into the sack way too quickly after Raven left, blah, 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 and there wasn't enough time. Oh, 2 years isn't enough time for these two to get into a relationship. I will disagree in that I think 2 years is more than enough time to begin with. Did I say 2.5? 2 years is more than enough to begin with, okay? I think that's more than enough to go on for these two to have a relationship, especially if they're both emotionally vulnerable. I think that's more than enough. Ty would be more emotionally vulnerable than Summer, but they'd still both be emotionally vulnerable, and if anything, that's the perfect way to lead into a relationship. Hell, it didn't even need to be primarily, you know, it could have just been for comfort at first, and then they had a kid, and then they decided, okay, well, you know what, you've been around helping me raise my daughter this whole time, and we're having a kid together, so we might as well just be together. Plain and simple. And I can totally see that being the case. But for those of you who don't think 2 years is enough time, here's a little timeline for you. Alright, now please keep in mind before we get into this that this is essentially my headcanon, and I'm basing this on very little. But to be fair, I will point out, so are all of you who do think Ruby is in fact Qrow's child. Because there's very little evidence one way or the other, unless of course you, like me, consider the words of Carrie, Miles, and rest in peace, Monty as valid, because I personally do, and that's good enough for me. And if I happen to be wrong, okay, I'll admit it. I'll even make a video in which I'll admit that I was wrong. I'm totally fine in doing that. But this is my personal headcanon, and I hope you are willing to accept that, the same way I'm willing to accept that you guys also happen to think what you think as well. Yes, I'm making this video, but it was more just because I wanted to get my viewpoint out there. I'm not trying to bash anybody. I hope that's entirely clear. I'm trying to, like, you know, as politely as I possibly can, express my views on the situation. Yeah, there's going to be an accompanying diagram that's going to form as you watch. So anyway, this is basically the way I figured things went down. So now let's say, and this is just some arbitrary numbers outside of some factual things, but let's say that Team Stark as a whole, in the current point in the timeline, not counting Summer because, you know, dead, let's say that everybody on Team Stark who is still alive is about 44. Just, you know, to give them a little bit of wiggle room and whatnot when it comes to canon. But anyway, and yeah, if they don't look 44, then assume that they've just, like, Remnant has the best, like, medical technology, and they've all aged remarkably well. Regardless, Okay, so then some canon stuff to bring into account. RWBY is canonically 17. Well, how do we know this? Because we know, unlike most of the other characters, we know for a fact when RWBY's birthday is. It is, canonically speaking, October 31st, Halloween. That's right, and granted, yes, this was technically first revealed in an episode of RWBY Chibi, and then confirmed, but it's still canon. And as such, RWBY is one of the few characters we can actually keep track of the age of, at least arbitrarily, because we don't really know exactly when things are taking place. But we know that, one, she, was 15 when she got to Beacon. We also know that the Vital Festival tournament takes place in fall, which is October. We have to, while it was otherwise unacknowledged, we have to assume that RWBY turned 16 sometime between the brief time skip we get at the end of Volume 3 when it transitions from fall to winter. We have to assume that she turned 16 there. And as for when she turned 17, we know that this occurred during Volume 5 because it was the fall semester, which means that everything that had happened at the fall of Beacon was at least a year ago, more than likely. So yeah, RWBY is canonically at this point 17, which is kind of weird because yes, time has passed, but it doesn't necessarily feel like 2 years have passed in the show at this point, but apparently it has. As for Yang, we don't know exactly how old she is because we, again, just don't know when her birthday is, but we do know that she's at least 18, possibly 19. The reason I made Team Stark 44 is to take into account whether or not, she actually is 19. So just to assume she is. Now, let's go on to the scenario I've always interpreted this to be. Now, again, this particular clip from Volume 2 is the thing that has always convinced me, because this is the scenario that jumped into my head the first time I heard it.
But I learned that the two of them had been on a team together with Summer and Qrow, and that she'd left me with him just after I was born.
Not to mention the fact that we also heard that this was when we learned that RWBY and Yang were, in fact, half-sisters. And so this is the part of the story that put this idea in my head in the first place.
But I learned that the two of them had been on a team together with Summer and Qrow, and that she'd left me with him just after I was born.
Keep that in mind because that's going to come up later. Now, going forward, we of course have to take into account several things. Now again, I'm going to be using a lot of hypotheticals in this scenario, so please bear with me. Now, assuming that I am correct in my assumption that the two are half-sisters, this is the scenario that I've always imagined. So let's assume that Team Stark stuck together throughout their years at Beacon. Let's assume that they stuck together for a while outside of Beacon before Raven decided to just GTFO. So let's assume that they had Yang when they were 26. And by the way, I'm collectively stating that Team Stark, not necessarily counting Raven because she, forfeited parenting rights, but assuming we're not counting Raven, then Summer and Ty and Qrow all had Yang together collectively. They were her family. They were raising her. Now, and again, we all have to assume that that is at the very least what happened, even if these, RWBY and Yang are not actually sisters, but in fact cousins, which I don't believe, but regardless. So, assuming this is the scenario, let's just say, like I said, let's say that Team Stark had her at 26. Now, in that case, that means that Ty and Summer would have had to have had her, RWBY being her in this case, at 28. Now, here's the thing that I think a lot of people never take into account. Time from conception to birth. So any person remotely, familiar with how birthing and stuff works knows that from conception to birth is, in humans, about 9 months, give or take a couple of weeks. Now, in this case, this is the scenario I've always considered. So, let's say that Team Stark stuck together throughout their 4 years at Beacon. Then they stuck together for a little bit longer, secretly working for the Oz Illuminati. Yeah, that just sounds stupid. I'm just going to stick to saying working for Ozpin. So let's assume that they continue to work for Ozpin for a little bit, and Raven decided to eventually leave because she couldn't handle the truth.
You can't handle the truth!
So she leaves. Now, at this point, there's no Yang. So let's assume that it's, they're all 25 at this point, because this is the scenario I've always envisioned. That Raven left while she was pregnant with Yang, but didn't know she was pregnant with Yang. And everybody else didn't know she was pregnant with Yang. That instead, what happened was, she got out of there, they were all super sad about it, and whatnot. Let's go back a bit. Now, assuming that Ty and Raven, because we don't know what kind of relationship they were. Were they married? If so, then technically they would still be married, although I guess you could say that they would be, separated, because, Raven is kind of being a biatch. But taking that into account, assuming that it was either super casual or there was something actually there, she left. Now let's give Raven a little leeway. Let's say she doesn't find out. Let's say that she leaves when she's about, let's say, 3 weeks to a month pregnant. Let's go with that. So let's say she's about a month pregnant at that point. A month or two later, she finds out that she's pregnant. But she doesn't go back to Ty or to Qrow or Summer. She doesn't return to her true family. She's still sticking with the bandits. Now, taking into account the idea that she didn't return to them when she found out she was pregnant, that means that for the next few months, they're all dealing with missing her and being heartbroken. Qrow the least, because Qrow knows his sister, and he either hasn't given up hope on her entirely, or knows her well enough that this kind of thing was probably inevitable, more or less. So they're all mostly solid, and in their heartbreak over the loss of one of their teammates, though not by death, of course, but just by her, kind of ditching them, Ty and Summer get together. This is the point where I'm spelling out plainly how they could, get together. Hell, it might not have even been the full situation. Maybe they just got super close. Maybe they didn't get full-on romantic. They were just super close at this point. So instead, what happens? Well, Raven stops by very briefly, maybe not even seen by the rest of Team Stark, but she does drop off a little bundle. Because this is what Yang says.
She'd left me with him just after I was born.
That's right. She says that her mother left her with Ty when she was born. So no indication that she had been around up until that point, just that she had left Yang with her. And I always interpreted that to mean that Raven was gone before this point and decided, you know what, this is his kid, let him deal with this problem. Again, that's my interpretation. You might have had a different interpretation, but this is the way I've personally viewed the situation. So anyway, Raven has once again flown the coop, pun intended in this case, and okay, Team Stark has been left with this kid. I think I already went over this a bit, but yeah, so they're all 26 at this point. 9 months has passed, and Ty and Summer have gotten particularly close. Then what should happen? Well, they slowly raise Yang. Yang doesn't have a mother figure outside of Summer, so at least in this kid's mind, Summer is her mother. And hell, based on Yang's story as told here,
Ruby and I grew up in Patch, an island just off the coast of Vale. Our parents were huntsmen. Our dad taught at Signal, and our mom would take on missions around the kingdom. Her name was Summer Rose, and she was like super mom, baker of cookies and slayer of giant monsters.
Yeah, she basically did think of Summer as her mother, and probably did think Summer was essentially her mother. Of course, what happens later is neither here nor there, but the important point is that she sees, Summer as her mother. Summer and Ty get super close because of this situation, because she's essentially helping him, raise, his kid. Now, Qrow, is definitely involved, but let's be honest. How, involved is he? Because, a good interpretation of what he would be doing during this point, outside of, helping, because I do think he definitely helped raise Yang up until a certain point, though, especially, if not even more after what happened to Summer. But even discounting that, I wouldn't be surprised if he was out mostly looking for Raven, or, as he has been when we first met him, working for Oz. So those are the two options that are most likely. He's either looking for his sister, or he's working for Oz, as he has more or less always been. So in that case, that means that, if anything, he would probably be off. Now, he could still be around at this point. He could be taking less frequent missions, maybe staying a lot longer than he actually did, later down the line, because of Summer's death. So I will allow that. Okay, let's say Qrow was around, and so there is still a possibility that he, is Ruby's father. But in my mind, what happened was Ty and Summer slowly grew closer as they were raising, Yang together with a little assistance from Qrow. Then what happened was they grew so close that they maybe had a passionate night together, and thus RWBY was conceived. Now, there doesn't need to be a romantic relationship between either of these pairings. Neither Qrow and Summer or Ty and Summer for RWBY to exist. Just that they had something going on. Because, let's be honest, the situation we've been interpreting this as could be totally wrong. Nobody could have been in a relationship with Summer, and her and Ty, or heaven forbid, her and Qrow could have easily just had a single night, one-night stand. I will concede this point, if it was a one-night stand, I might be more likely to believe that RWBY is Qrow's kid. I don't, but I'd probably concede to it more if that was the case. Regardless, in my headcanon, this is the scenario as I've presented it. I think it, I hope the diagram helped, this, I hope this whole, this little presentation helped, make what I've been saying here a little bit more clear, because I know I've been kind of rambling, but I feel like I've made my point. So basically, Raven leaves at some point before finding out she's pregnant. She finds out she's pregnant, but she doesn't go back right away. She goes back to drop off Yang. Yang ends up being raised by Ty and Summer, and partially by Qrow, but mostly Ty and Summer. Those two grow closer. Then suddenly they have a single passionate night. And again, keep in mind, they don't necessarily have to be in an actual relationship, but I feel like the way the situation has been described by Yang, I feel like it's much more likely if they were actually in a romantic relationship. Though, to be fair, we do not know what Qrow's full-on reaction was to Summer's death, but, we do have Ty's reaction, and his reaction, it sounds pretty damn strong, if I do say so myself. But regardless, they raise her for a bit. They have at least one night of passion, if not a full-on relationship, as a result of the time they spent together while Raven was gone, and during that time together raising Yang. And thus, RWBY is conceived. Voila, more than enough time for something to occur without it being, blasphemous. Even though I don't think it would be blasphemous, but it doesn't. But if you really think it's blasphemous for only 2 years to be enough time for these two to get together, okay, fine. But you know what? Now you have a slightly extra amount of time, as in at least 32. Yeah, 32. That's right. So let's say 32 months is exactly how long it passes between the time Raven leaves and RWBY is born. That is my headcanon, and until they give me something that outright disproves it, or in particular throws the whole thing in the Summer Qrow shippers, I guess, favor, until that is proven, or I guess, I don't know, the people who are in favor of Qrow being RWBY's daddy. Until something comes out in canon that throws that into, that particular line of thinking way more in your favor, okay, fine, I will concede at that point. But until then, this is my headcanon. And yeah, I hope I've presented this in a way that you can all understand. I know it might be a little bit confusing. Regardless, please, if you enjoyed this, please tell me, and if you didn't enjoy it, hell, tell me just as the same, because I'm genuinely curious about, if for those of you few people who do think that Ty is RWBY's dad, What are your thoughts on the situation? Did you come to a similar conclusion about the amount of time that passed? And if not, does 2 years seem like too little time to you? If not, if you really do think that Qrow is been hearing the same old evidence for this theory for so long, maybe that's why I'm sick of it. But I'm sorry, could present a slightly new argument. That's all I'm asking. Or present the same old argument and I will present my points a little more coherently, since I'm a little bit more easier to understand in written form. Or at least I think so. Anyway, this is Mike, Ringmaster of the Imagination Circus, and if you feel so inclined, thank you for visiting, and please do so again in the future. Good day.